Okay.
Hi, this is my interview for my project, and we're doing the 1980s, and the person I'm interviewing is Mr. Ambrose. So, Mr. Ambrose, where were you born?
I was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1980.
Yeah, where were you raised?
And I was raised in Malden, Mass.
And how was Malden? How was it during that time period?
It's good. I have a lot of fond memories of growing up. I attended public school from kindergarten to 8th grade in the Malden Public Schools. And I played Little League, played soccer, did Boy Scouts, and had a generally positive upbringing in Malden.
Did anything change much from 1980s to 2018?
Yeah, sure. There are a lot of changes over those years. I would say one big change was technology was one thing that I was very aware of. When I was growing up in the 80s, people did not have cell phones. We didn't have the internet. Those are things that I think have definitely shaped the way we live our lives today. And those represented some pretty big changes.
What are some of the biggest impacts that technology have on you during your high school period?
Attention
Yeah.
students taking the North Method bus. Your ride is here. Again, the North Method bus is in the West Courtyard.
Yeah, so in particular in high school, I remember the prevalence of computers at my school. We didn't have the internet at my high school, but we had computer labs. So a lot of the work we did was on computers, particularly I was on the newspaper staff and involved in some different clubs. So we did a lot of work on the computers and started to use technology for those things. So I would say the advent of having computer labs that were used a lot definitely came about when I was in high school, and that helped my learning a lot.
So how was planning events with friends different with or without technology?
Yeah, so I remember when I was in high school going into college, like my dad had a cell phone, and it seemed like every few people's dads had a cell phone, maybe, dads who were like businessmen or something. So not everyone had a cell phone when they first came out. So without having cell phones, we would use payphones. My friend Joe had a pager, like a beeper, so we could contact him, and then we could go and call up everybody. And oftentimes a lot of getting together would be like we'd plan to meet up somewhere. So we would say we'd go to the Malden Square bowling alley or a pizza place or a pool hall or Kelly's Roast Beef or Bickford's or the park to play baseball. And everyone would kind of just congregate there and meet up. And then from that place, we'd go to our next destination. So a lot of times it was like real kind of organic, just calling people up and saying, meet here at this time, and then get together and decide what to do.
So what is a beeper? What's a beeper?
So a beeper is like a little box, electronic box that you could call and sort of leave like a text message for. But the initial beepers didn't actually have words for text messages. You could just use numbers. So there'd be like different codes. So if you had a beeper, I could call you up and it would come up on your beeper that my phone number called you. So you would know to call that person back. And sometimes they would have codes. Like if I dialed you and then I put 911, that would be like an emergency and you got to call me back real quick. Or 411 would be like what's up. Or 143 would be like I love you. So people would have like different numerical codes that they would send to each other. So it's sort of like an early form of texting.
Oh, that's
And
what's up.
yeah, nowadays probably only doctors might have beepers. Not so many people have beepers anymore because technology of the cell phone has replaced that.
So you said your high school experience changed a lot. What was some of the major ways school is different when you went to it? Well, your high school from 1980s and from here.
Sure. One big difference is the technology. Nowadays, I think like every teacher is pretty much assuming that a student's going to have access to technology, access to a computer, access to the internet. And when I was growing up, that was not the case. So we did a lot more book learning. There was a lot more expectations to go to the library. In high school, we'd go to the library during the school day. We had a pretty good library at our high school. In elementary and middle school, we were expected to go to the library for research type assignments. So that was one way that the educational experience changed. Also, like I see like a lot more emphasis on like collaborative learning and different learning styles nowadays. Mm-hmm. So like for example, there's a lot more like presentations and group work and working in groups in classes nowadays. And I feel like when I was growing up, that wasn't really a point of emphasis. It was more like sit in rows, do your own work, raise your hand type thing. But now it's definitely more project based and
Saad
collaborative.
Rashid, please report to the main office in the high school. Saad Rashid to the main office in the high school, please.
What about the teaching? How was the teaching during high school?
Sure. In terms of teaching styles, I think I had a lot of great teachers growing up. I would say maybe some of the teachers were like more sort of traditional than others. So I think here at our high school, we have a lot of teachers who are doing really sort of unique and innovative things in their classroom. So I would say I always felt really supported by my teachers and that it was really a positive environment and a pretty well-structured environment. But it was a little bit different in terms of some of the different opportunities for activities we had. Like maybe I had more of a traditional, I can't remember doing too many presentations, for instance, and not even too much group work, maybe like 1 or 2 group assignments a year. But nowadays I feel like there's much more emphasis on that.
What are some historical events that occurred when you were growing up?
So
Attention drama club students, please stop by the theater before you leave today to pick up your raffle tickets. Again, drama club students, stop by the theater to pick up your raffle tickets.
yeah, one big historical event I remember is 1986 when I was in kindergarten was the Challenger disaster. So that was a space shuttle that was taking off to go into space, and it was a real big deal because it was the start of the Teacher in Space program. So there was a teacher from New Hampshire who's going to actually broadcast lessons down to Earth from the space shuttle, and the space shuttle took off, and I think it exploded within 90 seconds or something like that of liftoff. So that was something that a lot of young people like myself remembered when it happened, because since it was such a significant space launch, a lot of people were watching that live. So it was like one of those things where a large portion of the country was watching something live, and there was this big tragedy that occurred. So that was one thing that I remember pretty vividly growing up.
Anything else?
Other big events like 80s and 90s. I remember Bill Clinton being elected president. I remember Bill Clinton being very, very popular when he was elected. And then I remember later on the scandal involving Monica Lewinsky. That was something that stood out in my memory. Growing up in the early 90s, there were big riots in LA. And that kind of brought attention to the issue of race in America, which I still think we have today. Like a lot of the issues involving people of color and police officers, and there being a lot of conflicts between them, is very present in our life today. And I think that I remember very vividly early 90s that started out. There was a man named Rodney King, who was a man of color out in Los Angeles, and he got beat up really bad by 4 white police officers. And that was caught on tape. And as a result, there were these huge riots in Los Angeles and other parts of our country. So I remember that being something that was very vivid. I remember I was in middle school at the time.
That's what's up. Well, yeah, you told me that in the high school you were in the band, right?
Yes.
For band, where did you go into major places that were historically popular?
Oh yeah. So when I was in school, I played trombone in a band for many years, and in 2000 there was a presidential election. So President Bush was elected. He ran against Al Gore, and it was a really controversial historical election because Al Gore got the popular vote. He won the popular vote, but George W. Bush won the Electoral College. And typically, most cases, not all cases, typically it's popular vote winner and Electoral College vote winner are the same. But in that year, it was different. And that caused some controversy because George Bush's brother was the governor of Florida, and there were kind of some shady things going on with the election polling places down in Florida. So it was a very controversial election and subsequent inauguration of George W. Bush. My band that I was playing at the time got invited to George Bush's inauguration. Mm-hmm. So we got to go down, and actually I played my trombone in the inaugural parade for George W. Bush. And I remember it was very controversial because there were a lot of people from our school who didn't want us to go because they felt that George W. Bush was not fit to be in office. They felt like the circumstances that he got into office under were just not appropriate, not cool. They thought that there was some funny business going on. So the school, a lot of people at our school wanted us to protest by refusing the invitation to perform at the inauguration and not go. So I remember we in the band kind of felt divided and even asked to vote on it because it was sort of like a historical thing where we could have taken a stand and said, no, we're not going. But in the end, our band director said it would probably be better for us to go because it's the role of the president, the office of the president, once in a lifetime opportunity. And even though there were some different circumstances about him becoming into the office, he's still the president. So ultimately, we did wind up going, and I had the opportunity to go down to D.C. in January 2001 and perform down there.
What was your thoughts on going or not going during that time?
Yeah, I was a little conflicted at first because I voted in that election. I voted for Al Gore because I was already 18 at the time. Mm-hmm. So, it was the person who I did not support who ultimately got into office. But after my teacher talked to us, I kind of felt like he was right. Like, we should respect the office of the president. We should kind of go and take advantage of this once in a lifetime opportunity. So I was cool with the choice after we kind of had that dialogue with my teacher.
That's what's up. Did you play any actually? What was some of your favorite musical artists that had a huge impact during that time period?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I love the music of the time period a lot, and still to this day I listen to a lot of music, predominantly from like the 90s is probably like my wheelhouse of music. I really like a lot of alternative rock from that time, and I like a lot of hip-hop from that time. Mm-hmm. So there's a group that kind of brings those two genres together called the Beastie Boys, and they meant a lot to me because I really like the sound of their music. They kind of fused like punk rock and rap and hip-hop all together, so I really like that vibe. And also their rhymes were really really intelligent, and they were kind of challenging a lot of the stuff that was going on in hip-hop at the time. So they were challenging notions of like being disrespectful to women or having rap be all about making money. And they were sort of coming out with a different line of thought than a lot of people come out in rap songs. So I really respected that and appreciated that. And that was really, there are a lot of quotes from those songs that were really meaningful to me.
Is there any other major artists that did something about the racial controversies between blacks and whites and the police brutalities? Were there any other artists that stood up?
Oh yeah, absolutely. A lot of artists that I listened to. So that group, the Beastie Boys, like they were a bunch of white guys, but they grew up in the projects in New York City. So they were growing up around some poverty. They were very influenced by a lot of people of color in their music. So I think that they definitely spoke to issues of race. Other artists that I like that speak about that, there's a band called Rage Against the Machine that was really popular. So they talk a lot in very overt political terms about racism and government and other ideas like that. Their guitarist actually went to Harvard University, so he's really, really smart. And there are guys of all races in that group, so they were kind of like a big mouthpiece about issues of race in our country. They stood out to me as well. And another group that stood out was Public Enemy. It's a hip-hop group. Still pretty popular with Chuck D and Flava Flav and other MCs in that group. They spoke a lot, very open discourse about issues of race and bringing people together, and also challenging some of the issues that face our country in terms of race relations.
That's what's up. So I've noticed the research. Tupac and Biggie, of course, they were really huge during the 1980s and 90s, blowing up in the 2000s, early 2000s. What were your thoughts on both of the two?
Sure, yeah, I love Tupac. I love Biggie. I can still probably rap like all the lyrics to Tupac's Machiavelli album and Biggie's Mo Money, Mo Problems song. I listen to some of his music still a lot. There's a song by Biggie called Juicy, which you might know, and like it was all a dream. You should read Word Up magazine, you know that one, and that resonates with me a lot because that song actually begins with the line. He says, "I want to dedicate this album to all the teachers who told me it never amount to nothing." And I listen to that song like pretty much once a week since it came out, and I still listen to it today because it always reminds me of the impact that teachers obviously had a pretty negative impact on Biggie and kind of told him he couldn't do things, and yet he was actually like really talented with his wordplay and his use of the English language. So that song always reminds me to encourage everybody in the classroom because you never know what greatness you might have in front of you that just needs to be mentored a little bit. Biggie and Tupac are both favorites of mine and my wife. I loved Tupac had a persona that came out. He called it Machiavelli. And a lot of his famous songs like To Live and Die in LA came out under that persona. I remember that very vividly. Biggie, Tupac, Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, love those artists were coming to prominence in the early 90s to mid 90s, back when I was in middle school and in high school. and they definitely played a role, especially in Malden. A lot of kids were listening to that music and getting really, really excited about it. Absolutely, I think Biggie and Tupac are still like some of the most talented MCs in terms of like the way they use internal rhyme and puns. They actually do a lot of really sophisticated stuff with it's almost like poetry, you could say.
Well, why do you think, in your opinion, why was music such a gateway of sending out messages to people and making it heard around the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think music is something that generally like people can get really excited about and really hyped up about. You know, if you're looking to watch a movie, that might be 90 minutes to 2 hours or longer. If you're looking to read a book, some people aren't readers. But I think music is really accessible to people.
Yeah.
You know, any of us can digest a 3-minute song. You know, you'd be like, oh, check out this track, and you can listen to it. And I think that in the 90s, it was a really unique time where, like, in Malden Middle School, where I grew up, there are a lot of people of different socioeconomic classes, different races, and everybody kind of came together around music, particularly hip hop music. You know, I felt like it was something that I could connect with some of my peers about, and I think that music brings people together because of that. You know, you might like the rhythm of it, you might like the beat of it, and that's going to draw you in. It's something you can share. And then that allows you access to a message, and it's sort of like an easy digestible message because it's only like a short, like 3 or 4 minute song, and it's something that can be memorable to you and have an impact.
All right. So, sports. What was sport? I'm playing basketball, football, and all those sports. Like in 1980s, was basketball as huge as it was as now? It was football also. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I've been a big NBA fan, like pretty much for my whole life. Basketball was real big, you know, in the 80s with Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and then in the 90s with Michael Jordan coming to prominence, and like Michael Jordan winning the 6 titles in the 90s. Yeah, I remember a lot of those games very, very vividly. So I think NBA was really, really popular at the time. And I think similar to how you have today, you have icons in the game like Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, LeBron James, kind of larger than life. You had back then like Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, and then a whole wave of other guys like Charles Barkley and Grant Hill and Dennis Rodman and other guys who were real big personas. So I remember growing up, like we used to all have our basketball jerseys, and we go to my friend Matt's house every day and just play basketball. And there were 6 of us, and we played 3-on-3, and we'd all wear the NBA jerseys. So I think that basketball was definitely really popular back then. I played baseball and soccer growing up. I feel like baseball was really, really popular when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. And when I was in school, like we would talk a lot about baseball, and everybody would know people on the Red Sox, and everybody would know about the home run hitters like Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa and Barry Bonds. And nowadays, I feel like baseball isn't as popular. I feel like if you ask our students, not all of them are going to know players on the Red Sox or be aware of what's going on. So I would say that like NBA has been pretty consistently popular throughout that time with young people. I would say that baseball was really, really popular back then. Football was popular, but the Patriots weren't really good. So I think now like NFL has definitely taken over for popularity, and baseball's kind of taking a little bit more of a backseat.
What was your thoughts on I forgot his name, but he was one of the first Black African American baseball players.
Jackie Robinson?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting to think about, like in terms of Boston sports history, because the Celtics were the first team to ever have a black coach, first team to ever have a black player start for them, and the first team to have an all-black starting 5. So they were like really at the forefront of integration. Whereas in baseball, the Red Sox were actually one of the last teams to integrate. They integrated years after Jackie Robinson came into the league. So it's kind of interesting to look at from the perspective of a Boston fan, because in basketball, they were so innovative in integration, and in baseball, not so much. I think the story of Jackie Robinson is pretty amazing. I think today we still struggle a lot with race relations in our country, and acceptance and tolerance. And to think about somebody doing something like that decades ago is really, really notable.
All right. So what was some of the fashions back in the 1980s?
All right. So fashions. Let's see. I remember a lot of people wore like denim shorts, like jean shorts. I remember like high school high top basketball sneakers were really popular. Converse was actually pretty popular back in the 80s, because that's what all the best players like Larry Bird and Magic Johnson and Isaiah Thomas and Dr. J, they all wore Converse. So it wasn't until Michael Jordan came along that Nike actually became like the cooler brand. They had these pump-up sneakers called Reebok pumps that Shaquille O'Neal and other players wore, where you would have like this little pump on the tongue and you would pump it up in order to make it feel real tight. And people thought that made them jump higher or something like that. I remember I had a rat tail for the 80s, so I had short hair, but then I grew my hair long like a little mini ponytail, and that was pretty terrible, but I rocked that for a little while. But it's actually interesting because like a lot of the styles that you see today are kind of definitely harkening back to the 80s and early 90s. You know, like Jordans, I remember in 6th grade, you know, my friend Tim getting the first pair of Jordans and us thinking it was the coolest thing in the world. Or guys wearing like a flat top hairstyle, or like skinnier jeans, you know, or some of the styles that like the ladies are wearing these days with like scrunchies in their hair, big poofy shirts. Like those are things that were popular, and a lot of bright colors too. Like in the 80s, like everything was neon, so you know, just really bright, like yellow and green and pink and orange, stuff like that was real popular.
What was some of the was there any like fashion idols out there that sent out a huge message to in a positive way to like for the racial anything like that?
Yeah, like fashion. A lot of hip hop artists would wear like T-shirts with messages on them about race relations. There was this company that's actually making a comeback now called Cross Colors, and I remember being young and everybody had those. People of all ethnicities had those. So like I rocked the Cross Colors T-shirts. A lot of my friends rocked them, white kids, people of color, like all sorts of people. And those were shirts like emblazoned with positive message about race and acceptance and basic love, cutting across all colors and being accepting. And that became really popular like late 80s, early 90s with like some of those hip hop artists like I was mentioning, like Public Enemy, BC Boys, Biggie, Tupac would kind of wear this style to kind of show off some positive messages about race.
No, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. What about transportation? How was transportation back in the 1980s?
All right, so I did not have a car myself when I was even when I got into high school. I didn't have my own car. I didn't get my own car until I started working here. So most of us was we got around on foot. We used the T. I lived right on the Orange Line, so we would hop on the Orange Line at Oak Grove and take the Orange Line into Boston to North Station or Haymarket and kind of go around Faneuil Hall, and we go to Newbury Street. We take the bus a lot. We take the bus to the bowling alley or things like that. And sometimes like we'd just pile in one of our friends' parents' cars, and they would drive us up to the Square One Mall or Malden Square to the bowling alley and things like that. So pretty much it was like communal transportation. We didn't have Uber. People didn't have cars, so it was a lot of like walking. Malden was pretty accessible with walking. I would ride my bike sometimes too. And then just as I got older, riding the bus and the train to get places.
So did anything change between like for example, you said you took the train and the bus. Did how should I say it? Nah, never mind.
So I mean, so taking the bus is like, it's more expensive now. Like back in the day, like when I first started taking the train, like the train was like 85 cents, and now I think it's like 2 something to get on. So that's something that changed. And also another thing that I see change is like kids these days are like figuring out with their app, you know, doing like Uber or Lyft and orchestrating their own rides. And in my day, it was more like you would use the payphone to call your parents for a ride. Like my school had payphones, my middle school and my high school had payphones. So at the end of the day, whereas here a lot of kids are on their cell phone, kids would be calling their parents saying like, oh, I have football practice, so I'm going to be working out until whatever time. Or they just arrange their own transportation on the bus or walk home.
What was some of the biggest car companies like that came out that everyone had, or because nowadays there's multiple cars, Ferraris, people driving Audis, Infinitis. Like what was like one of the biggest car brand that came out during the 1990s, 1980s?
Sure, yeah. I feel like I remember like a lot of American-made cars. Like I feel like nowadays there's a lot of foreign import cars, like the brands that you mentioned. And you know, when I was growing up, when I got into high school and some of my friends started to get cars, most of them got American-made cars, Chevy or Dodge. You know, Dodge had like some pretty cool like sporty cars, like the Dodge Daytona was a brand of car. I remember one of my buddies had that. So yeah, a lot of American-made cars, and when I was going to school, a lot of kids would either get like a hand-me-down car, something like their parents had used it for years and then kind of handed it down to them, or would get a car, relatively cheap. Like I remember, like when I was growing up, it was like $3,000 was like if you have $3,000, you could get a good used car. That was like not that that's like cheap because I don't have that much in my pocket right now, but. Cheaper than some of the newer cars that are out here now. So yeah, I remember a lot of American cars then.
Yeah, nowadays cars are like more than 20, like 30, 40,000 just to buy a Nissan or something like that. But yeah, well, that's the end of our interview.
Okay.
Thank you for answering my questions that I had about the 1990s and 1980s. It was great, and that's it.
Great, thank you, Rev. You did a good job.